Hi there, I'm Moscatello, and this is Article Club, where we read, annotate, and discuss one great article every month on race, education, or culture. Thank you everyone for being here, and I hope fall is progressing nicely for you. It's October, and this month we've been focusing on an outstanding article that was published a few months back in New York Magazine. It's a piece by Caitlin Moscatello, and it's titled The Monster at the Dinner Table. This is an article about a newish and very scary condition that is affecting kids called ARFID, which is short for Avoidant Restrictive Food Intake Disorder. In short, kids with ARFID no longer are interested in eating. Sometimes it's mild, like if your kid wants to eat only chicken nuggets, but in some cases it's extreme, as in your kid doesn't eat at all. It was wonderful to get to talk to Ms. Moscatello about her piece, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you think about the interview. In our conversation, she and I talked about a number of topics, including how this article came about, how scary this condition is for parents, and how, as a society, we have ridiculous expectations for parents. Ms. Moscatello also talked about how she approached reporting the piece, including how she did research on ARFID and how she built trust with their sources so that they would share their experiences with vulnerability and authenticity. All right, here's the conversation. I hope you like it. Kaylin, thank you so much for doing Article Club.
Thank you for having me.
Your piece was so amazing when it came out. It was a little shocking. It was new. It was called Too Afraid to Eat in New York Magazine. I have the actual physical copy here. I was really struck by it. And so I was like, okay, I need to talk to Caitlin. So my first question is like, how did this come to you?
Yeah, I mean, this started with, well, I guess to begin, so I'm a parent. I have two kids, one in preschool, one in elementary school. And so this started with a conversation with Genevieve Smith, who's the executive editor at the magazine. And she also has kids. And ARFID is something that's been in the conversation, I would say newly in the conversation in parenting circles. But I didn't know a ton about it, and she didn't know a ton about it. And we were curious in just, how long has this been around? Sort of the natural questions, right? Is this a new phenomenon? What exactly is this? What causes it? How does it impact families? And so it started as a conversation between me and one of the editors, and just I was curious as well. And so that was the beginning of the reporting. It was really as simple as that conversation and having heard about ARFID, but not having a deep understanding of it.
As far as the reporting, did you start with ARFID or did you start like trying to find folks? Because the parents that you interview are like truly, truly amazing because there's like so much to do in this piece. So where'd you start in sort of like your background?
I started with ARFID. I knew I was writing a piece about ARFID. And it became clear really early on. I interviewed so many parents for this story, only a fraction of whom are actually in the piece, although the rest of them certainly inform what's in there. It became very clear early on that ARFID is something that impacts an entire family. And the desperation, the fear, the anxiety was so palpable in those early conversations. So there were sort of these two different lines of reporting. One line was speaking with medical experts, psychiatrists, psychologists, feeding specialists, therapists to figure out, what is the approach? And it is a multidisciplinary approach. What is the approach to diagnosis, to treatment? What causes this? What are the different manifestations? Because there are three distinct presentations of ARFID. There can be overlap, but there's sort of three buckets. And getting that piece of it. And then the other piece was speaking with families. And in some instances also, I did speak with the kids, or some of them are teenagers. So getting those two things and then weaving them together. And really, there are so many stories that could have been chosen, and they're all important. And I think they all certainly tell of a really harrowing experience.
Yeah, let's start with the medical part because that part you had a lot to do. And as a reader, it was totally new to me. And yet your ability to both be clear as well as to be specific was really effective for me. And so, for example, just even knowing that this is not bulimia, this is not anorexia, this is totally different. And then also the three different categories. My question is like, How do you know, as a writer, when you've sort of like got it with regard to the amount of information that you have, and then to sort of be able to share the amount of information, not too much, not too little, but also in the way where it's like immediately understandable by the reader?
I mean, this is where I think every writer needs to give credit to their editor. So Joy Shan, who's a features editor at New York Magazine, she edited this piece. She's an incredible editor. And so a lot of it was conversations with her. I end up typically with any piece I do, I might do anywhere from 20 to 50 interviews. This piece also, there was a lot of medical research, there were studies, I was reading the diagnostic manual. So it was really taking what ends up being, what can feel like piles and piles of information that live in my brain and of course in transcripts and everything else on my computer. And then Joy and I would have these long conversations, and she would kind of help me also say, well, this is really interesting. This is confusing. Can we find out more about this? And so that process, I think, really helped in terms of being able to narrow this down into a narrative that is digestible, that someone can pick up and read and hopefully really learn something. But I think that was also why it was really important to have the personal stories, because something I think about when I'm doing a piece of this size is how do I get the reader from the top to that bottom, right? And so for me, there has to be a story. You have to connect. There has to be some sort of human connection to that. And that's why you end up in this piece, we end up with sort of the spine of that story is this one family's experience. And then woven in that is a lot of the medical information. And there's multiple drafts. I mean, I did my first draft of this in March and it published in July. So I do think my first draft was very dense and very heavy in medical information and studies and interviews with experts. And so it's great to have an editor then who can read that and say, this is really dense. How do we let's go back and make this a little more conversational or make this a little more digestible. So that process really is what helps make that, I think, a better, stronger read.
Yeah, I agree with you. Like, I think I was more ready to take in all of that information after I had a connection, with your primary characters in the story. And it was very interesting. Like, when I got to the ARFID part, I was like, oh, I was a picky eater. And I know a lot of my friends who are parents who have kids who go through like a chicken nugget phase or whatever. And there is even desperation, even when it doesn't even get that horrible. But I was noticing that I was relating only after you introduced, the family, the main family in the story. I was just hooked right from the beginning, from your first line, where you write, Laura still wonders how different things would be if she and her husband Mark had simply chosen another camp. And of course, like I like to ask writers, how do you write, But like as far as that specific line, which is just totally drew me in, do you remember the process for getting there? Of course, you can talk about your editor again, but like trying to figure out how do you land that first line? Because I knew I didn't care how long this article was going to be, like you had me from the beginning.
This doesn't always happen, but usually that first line is actually one that was, I want to say, in the original draft. That's like one of the things. I'm a top to bottom writer. So I know some writers who they write not necessarily in order and they'll kind of weave it together at the end. I'm not like that. The way my brain works, I need to start at the top and go in order. And so I spend so much time on an opening paragraph. It is not abnormal for me to spend 4 days or 5 days on an opening paragraph. And the first part of a piece is always the densest and most difficult for me to get going. And then things, start to solidify further down and it does get easier. But no, that I knew I wanted to start with the family, and that piece of it, I think as a parent, I really empathize with this feeling of we all want the best for our kids and we all wonder, are we doing this right? And so that sentiment just that stayed with me. And I also thought that might draw in other people who maybe they have kids themselves or they work with children, or like you said, just knowing people with children, right? And you sort of hear that experience. And it seemed kind of universal, the idea of questioning. And so
Mhm.
that's why I started with that.
The compassion that you share with not just the main family, but all families, it just comes off the page. And so I wanted to ask, how did you get to know Laura and Mark and Amelia as far as like, it just feels like you really got to know them more. And so not just like, why did you choose them as like the central family, but also
Yeah.
what is the reporter's work that you did in order to really get them to open up about this vulnerability, about this desperation? I really felt like you were there with them.
Well, thank you. Much of that is due to Mark and Laura. I really can't take credit for they were so open and not just about their experience with their daughter's experience and their experience as a family. They were open about their marriage. They were open about, Laura was open about her own struggles with anxiety. And they were willing to be quite personal. And I think the motivation for that for them was that when their daughter was diagnosed with ARFID, where they had never heard of it before, they said there wasn't a lot of digestible information. And so they really were motivated by wanting to help other families. And that was really important. And I would say the same for many of the parents that I spoke with who were really generous with their time and being able to be vulnerable. Some of the parents I spoke with were in inpatient clinics at the time while their kids were currently being treated. So I'm certainly grateful to them. And I would give Mark and Laura a lot of the credit for that. I think from a reporting perspective, a lot of stories I do involve children, and I'm very sensitive to, you'll notice that the names are changed in that instance. And I would say when I started in journalism 20 years ago, the idea was like, you never change names, you always want full names as much as you can. And I do think that's true if you're investigating powerful figures or you're writing about politics or things like that. But I think when you're writing about children, there's a real responsibility in thinking about how would this child feel as an adult if,
Mhm.
the internet's forever.
Mhm.
How can I protect this child's privacy while still getting this story across? And I don't think anything is lost in this instance by not identifying the child. So there's a trust. It is a trust building that happens. None of these are one-off interviews, right? So it's not like, you know, we talk once and I write the story. I mean, I reported this story for, I guess it was maybe 8 or 9 months. And so I was in contact with Mark and Laura for probably 7 of those months. And so you do build a relationship. It's really making sure that the source feels like they're being respected.
I feel, in addition to the compassion that you had with this family as well as others, it also felt like you were really responsible to sort of like the other aspects of parenting that may or may not be influencing this whole ARFID situation. Like, and that was really, I think, hard probably to write about, like this idea that we don't exactly know all the different aspects and all the different triggers that sort of like happen. And you don't want to blame the parents for parenting because like
Yeah.
they're doing such a good job. And yet, as you sort of talk about in the research, there is, I mean, obviously the interactions and the engagements that you have with your child, as well as what the child is seeing with regard to anxiety, it just was incredibly nimble how you were able to navigate that. And I just want to like appreciate, I don't even know if I have a question
Oh,
about it, but I just
thanks.
want to appreciate that part because it really felt like you were still really honoring the parents because they are doing the best that they can, especially like you have your kid at the dinner table, as you write about, and they're not eating. And then so what do you do? Like there's such a desperation.
And parenting is hard. There isn't a single guide on how to do it. Eating is one of these things where, there's lots of kids who one of my sons, for instance, he's sensitive to certain textures. And so he doesn't like things necessarily that have like buttons or collars. He won't like the feel of that. But that's fine because I can choose a shirt that doesn't have a collar, right? Or I can choose something that doesn't have those buttons that bother him. There's no way that your kid can't eat. There's no option for, okay, well, this is, really difficult for you. And so we'll do a workaround. There's no, your child has to eat to live. They need nourishment to live. And so that piece of it just was, I don't know. I just felt so much for these parents. And also, if you think about parenting culture now, not only do we live in this more intensive parenting culture where I think so much is expected of parents all the time, and we're supposed to sort of be this like calm, like Zen space, which is difficult. It's difficult to maintain that kind of regulation. And at the same time, food and has become this terrain of parenting that's, people in our era of Instagram and TikTok, right? Like people are making these wonderful meals, or they post their like bento boxes that they're sending for their kids. They feed their kids healthy food, organic foods. And there is this feeling of, right, that if you feed your child and the way you feed your child says something about you as a parent. So then what happens when your child won't eat? Or what happens when your child will only eat these ultra processed foods, which provide a consistency that we know some kids with ARFID, really rely on? What does that feel like? And then beyond that, what does it do when we're also told that, mealtime is like this point for connection? It's when we sit down as a family. And there's these studies, I mean, they're kind of, I think one of them has been, don't quote me on this, but I think one of them has been largely debunked, but they're like, kids who have dinner with their parents every night have, higher SAT scores or something along those lines, or do better in school. And beyond that, just that like this is a period for connection. Well, what happens when it's a nightmare? What happens when a family sits down and it is a battle and the parents don't necessarily agree on the best way to move forward, or parents lose their ability to regulate because they've worked a long day and they've got kids and they sit down and they just want to eat and they want to have that family experience of how was your day? And it can't happen because of this sort of, monster at the table. Monster being ARFID, not the child, let me be clear. And so the parenting part of it, I think, was really crucial to telling the story, because I think that ARFID isn't new. ARFID has been around, and there are certainly adults who have ARFID and who had it as a child, and now we have an understanding for it. And yet I don't think the public consciousness isn't totally there, right? It's not as mainstream as anorexia. Everyone sort of knows what anorexia is, and it's something that's in movies and it's been in books, and there's famous people who have come forward. So there's a lot more familiarity. Anyway, sorry, I feel like I'm going off on a bit of a tangent, but yes, the parenting piece was very visceral to me, and also just felt really crucial in telling this story.
Yeah, I appreciate your point about like how anorexia is something that we sort of know about now as society. And as parents, like if we sort of see those signs, then I guess we sort of know what to do. Whereas with ARFID, or this idea of quote unquote picky eating, there's just not enough knowledge. And obviously, so your piece is quite helpful. So it does get to this desperation, as well as this idea of like control versus not control. I think that where I really got in your piece was a series of questions that you asked. How much control do we have over our children, or how much control should we exert? When does our vigilance contribute to our children's anxieties? And when is it the only thing keeping them alive? I mean, just a series of questions just like really got to how profound this is, how deep, this issue is. And I really also appreciate how you sort of spoke perhaps to Gen Xers as well as boomers with regard to their parenting. There were a couple specific examples where you sort of brought up, oh, in the 80s, this is what sort of was expected. You just sort of ate everything, which of course, at least anecdotally, I think probably led to other eating issues. And so like, I really felt like you were both honoring as well as interrogating a little bit of the, I guess, stereotypical millennial style, or as you write in another piece, like earnest parenting or gentle parenting. So I feel like you're sort of talking to different sort of groups here and trying to bring it into a piece, but also like considering your readers. And so I guess that's my question is who do you feel like you were trying to write to? And how did you sort of balance perhaps the different groups of people who are reading your piece?
Oh, that's a good question. I am constantly thinking about readers. I'm not thinking of a singular profile of like, I'm writing this piece for like this specific person. Sometimes it's as simple as, would I read this? What would get me interested? How do I kind of reach as many people as possible? How do I engage with a natural skepticism that I would expect a reader to have on a topic like this that they might not have heard of before, or they might not fully understand? How do I try to address those things, right, within the reporting without at the same time necessarily, you don't want to be telling a story that you're not catering, right? You can't cater a story in that way, like tell people what you think they want to hear. But I think it's certainly important to think, what would the questions be that my reader, that that a person might have reading this piece. What would a skeptic of this topic say? What would their questions be? And so it's kind of thinking about that. And then the reader experience is maybe more just that connection that I talked about earlier. How do I create a narrative out of something that's, medical? How do we kind of get someone through 6,000 words or whatever it is, where they will learn with this, but that they can connect with it in a way that doesn't feel clinical? There's, lots of medical journals for that kind of thing. So yeah, I mean, I think that's sort of the art of magazine writing and feature writing is weaving those two things together, weaving the narrative with, whatever sort of that robust, in this case, medical research, what that is, and getting that into one piece cohesively.
I appreciate that you don't necessarily want to share with your reader what you want them to sort of like believe or think, which I think that's sort of what you're saying. But at the end, you do have, I think, a substantive part about next steps or like treatment or sort of like where we're going. And I think that that was also a very helpful section, but it wasn't like there are no easy answers is really what
Yeah,
you're sort of sharing. And
yeah,
so I guess I wanted to ask, like, I don't want to give any spoilers away about what happens at the end, but it feels
sure.
like you trend toward we don't really know what's happening. We don't know where this is going, but there should still be some hope here toward the end, to sort of like have the narrative arc.
Yeah,
Why'd you choose that? Not just for the story. I mean, it's true about what
yeah,
happened,
yeah,
but obviously you had to make a choice in this long piece to sort of go there with your narrative arc. Can you speak a little bit about how you framed the end of your piece?
yeah. Well, I think that was the real arc of Mark and Laura.
Hmm.
That's what their family is experiencing. And so there is hope in their story, but it is certainly not tied with a bow. It is not, there are no tidy answers for this. And many people with ARF, this is something that this will be a challenge in their life into adulthood. So it's not necessarily, I think that was very real and very true to a lot of the experiences of the people that I spoke with, which is that, this is something that there are treatments, but there's not a cure. And so what does that look like? And so there is hope in effective treatment, but it's not necessarily, oh, and now we're done with that and everything's great, right? Which is true of a lot of things in life and certainly in parenting too. So it's a marathon. Yeah.
Absolutely. I want to thank you so much for all your time. I have
Oh,
one more question, which is in a few weeks, we're going to get on Zoom and talk about your piece. And folks come in with all these different questions, but I like to sometimes ask the writers, like, hey, what would you want to sort of like know about with regard to what we talk about? Like, is there something from readers that you would like us to ask of ourselves in our discussion?
oh, interesting. Well, I guess I would be curious with readers, something that I maybe hoped for with this piece subconsciously, and recognized more even when it came out, was there's, I think, a natural inclination for judgment when it comes to parenting. And we've all been at whatever it might be, like an amusement park, a playground, a birthday party, a dinner party, a holiday, with a child who's having a hard time, with parents who are having a hard time. And one of my hopes, I think, again, without fully recognizing this when I was writing it, was that this might provide a little more space and a little more empathy for those families, for that kid, for those parents, because like you really don't know what anyone else is going through at home, and certainly when there's a child involved as well, and that we might just sort of give a little more grace. And so I guess I would be curious from readers who have children in their lives, whether as parents or maybe aunts, uncles, friends, whatever it is, if ARFID or not, food or not, if this made them think about those experience of those families, and if it did open them up a little bit to maybe that grace.
That's perfect. Thank you,
Yeah.
Caitlin, once again for all of your thoughts, for sharing this piece with us, as well as your perspective. Really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you, Mark. Appreciate it.
I want to thank Caitlin Moscatello one more time for generously coming on Article Club and having this conversation. And I want to thank you too, dear listener, for really taking in her thoughts about her article, The Monster at the Dinner Table. If this interview intrigued you and you want to join our discussion on October 26th, there's still room. All you need to do is go to highlighter.cc/discussion to sign up. One more time, thank you so much for being part of Article Club, and I hope you have a great weekend ahead.